I hope that all of these like young kids that want to become scientists or artists or, like Latinos that are first generation, second generation, they watch the film and they're like, oh, wow, like I want to be like Tenoch. We need more of that kind of representation because it obviously is part of the scientific community, but we don't see it in popular culture and we don't see it in films.
Hey, it's Kristen, and today we are chatting with Alexis Gambis, who wrote and directed the powerful Sundance film Son of Monarchs. Enjoy our conversation. I would love to hear a little bit more about the inspiration of, for where this film came from.
It's been in the works for around 3 to 4 years. It started with my obsession, one could say, or my fascination with the monarch butterfly. A lot of times my films are, it's always very hard to construct a film. So I oftentimes channel like animals as kind of like my starting point when I think about films. And the monarch butterfly was an interesting insect because it connected. There was a lot of, first of all, it migrates from Canada through the US and arrives in Mexico. So it's one of the longest migration. But it was a really interesting kind of metaphor to speak about immigration. There was a lot of activists and protests that were happening were undocumented workers and kind of, affirming migrant rights. We're using the monarch butterfly and saying like, we are all monarchs, we all have the right to migrate, no borders, migration is beautiful. So that was another occurrence of the butterfly. And then in Mexico, it represented the kind of the souls of the dead arriving. And then finally, in the science world, people were trying to understand it was been a field that's growing in the last few years where people can now, with like new techniques, can now study the colors and patterns of butterfly wings, and they can study how those butterflies create those colors. So with all of those ideas, I started constructing all of my characters, a butterfly scientist, him going back to Mexico, a town that kind of, in a very kind of Garcia Marquez, like magical realism, a town that is surrounded by like a butterfly town, basically. So that's kind of the origin of the story. And then, and then of course there's a lot of work that goes into documentation, research, trying to understand, create the characters and the stories.
That's so cool that there are so many elements that connect back to this butterfly. I love kind of like dissecting, like what do things mean, and to see that just the butterfly itself, the monarch butterfly, represents so many different things for so many cultures and so many experiences is so fascinating.
What's fascinating about the monarch is that it's also like very romanticized. Like people love butterflies, and I've seen such a like passion since I made this film. Like people send me photos of their butterflies in their gardens and saying like, oh, the monarchs are here. And also what's interesting is that the monarch doesn't really have one nationality, right? It's Canadian. I mean, there are monarchs all around the world, but the one that migrates is Canadian, American, and Mexican. And every country takes pride in the monarch. It's like, oh, the monarchs are here, they're part of our culture. And then in Mexico, it's on the money. It's on like 50 pesos. You see the monarch. And then in Canada, I mean, it's where where they hatch. I mean, it's amazing. It's where they start their flight. So I think it's really amazing because there are so much polarized discussion about like refugees, immigration, especially in the last administration, that how amazing is that this monarch butterfly doesn't have to deal with these issues.
Exactly.
It doesn't need a visa. It doesn't need a visa to cross borders.
How did you balance these ideas of science and culture in this film?
I mean, I think for one, science is culture, number one. So I think a lot of discussions that we're having now about, a lot of cultural phenomenon, a lot of like social political discourse, all of it is embedded, like comes back to scientific issues, right? Because, climate change, endangered species, I think it's really important to connect those worlds and understand that, there's an ecosystem of animals. Like if you endanger the monarch butterfly, when the butterfly currently is endangered, very severely, it's actually on the verge of extinction, which is horrible. But it affects many other organisms, and it has like a cascade effect on many other organisms. But the same with like science in the context of culture, politics, geography, all of these things come back and are intertwined. So I think for me, it was important to connect those things. Oftentimes the way I connect those things is always through the vessel of a character. I don't really like to enforce connections. It's always like the character. The character represents science because he's a scientist. He also represents being in between two cultures because he lives in New York, goes to Mexico. So characters allow me to kind of enrich all of these conversations about, about environmental issues, about culture, about science. I don't really want to kind of enforce as a filmmaker, my own views about these topics. And I would rather the protagonist be the one speaking out about them.
Your films often combine like documentary and fiction and sort of explore science through storytelling, which is, it's just so unique to see that parallel between art and science. So where did that passion come from for you?
I grew up in an environment where art and science were coexisted. My parents are both artists. My dad's a painter. My mom's a filmmaker. I also have always been interested in like visual arts and film. And I was also interested in biology. And my dad, before becoming a painter, was an engineer, and my mom was a sociologist. So for me, those worlds were very connected. And I would, as a kid, I remember like my dad would help me with my math homework. But he's a painter, he's a very kind of established painter, and I grew up in that kind of environment of him exhibiting his work. So for me, those two worlds kind of coexisted, and I think that it's important to make films that connect those two worlds and show how creative it is to be a scientist, and also in the artistic process, how much science is required as well. I also teach at NYU. I teach a class called docufiction, which is all about combining documentary and fiction. It's important to understand that every film that you make is part documentary, part fiction. No matter whether or not at the end it's considered to be a feature narrative or a documentary film. And I think sometimes when you need to get more to the authenticity of something, you need to use documentary techniques. Like, I'm not from Mexico, so I had to engage in, I had to do documentary work. I also had to work with non-actors. And I also like the feeling when you're watching a film that you don't know whether what you're watching is like, it has like a documentary feel to it, but then it goes into like magical realism. It goes into dreams. It goes into science fiction with a tattoo. I like playing around with form so that people are lose their groundings. They don't know like, okay, what is this? Is this like documentary fiction, surrealism, hardcore science? I think it's really important. It's the same idea of creating a mosaic of different elements. Same with form. I like kind of blending those forms together. And so, yeah, and most of the time before I make a fiction movie, there's a lot of documentary work that goes into it and documentary short films that I make.
You mentioned that you were working with non-actors in this film. What was that like?
Well, I think it's really stimulating on both ends. I think it's really amazing for established actors to be in that environment where they're working with non-actors. I think it challenges them to also help direct the non-actors. So it's not only about me directing, but also the actor takes on the responsibility of bringing in these people in this community into the film. And I think it's important because it also, I shot in a small town in Mexico, and we did a casting for people in the area. And I think it's important that since the film is about that region, I mean, it makes total sense to feature them in the film, feature the kids, feature some of the locals that were part of the ritual, and it adds like such an amazing layer to the film because we're not only talking about where they're from, but they're actually in the film. And I think it's really powerful. And non-actors surprise you because they understand more than anybody where they're from, their lives, and I think it really informs the film. And it's very important. And it's a way for me to be able to tackle some of the local issues in a way in which I can have them speak about their condition and what they're going through, rather than me kind of just inventing, or creating cliches or stereotypes, or, and I think that's it's really great. And you definitely need in some situations actors, because being an actor requires you to be like very long days. It's exhausting. Some of the things that may not be possible for a non-actor, you have to do take after take after take. And so I like combining those two worlds.
You get that like really honest, like authentic, like you're telling their truth. So that is.
Yeah, we had kids from the schools that were like so into it. I mean, there are problems, of course. They look into the camera, They don't know what's happening. But then there's also like they're so new to it that they can provide such like amazing ideas that they haven't been like blasé by like the film industry, you know. They're like these kids in a town, and you know, and I tell them, you know, like run as a butterfly, and they'll just do it.
There were also such incredible visuals in this film, and I mean, filming in that beautiful monarch butterfly forest. What was it like, kind of just bringing all that together and filming in that forest?
First of all, it wasn't easy because it requires a lot of permissions to be able to shoot there. But that's why I had gone like a year or two before, and I had met the people from the biosphere that protect the, you know, it's hard because you need, you know, they want to make sure that it's also a very, very protected area. The monarch butterfly is endangered. They're worried about you stepping on the butterflies. I mean, there's a lot of that. But once we were able to get their trust and explain to them what we were doing, and also because I'm a biologist, I also explained that this was a film about, you know, scientific communication, even though it was a fiction movie. But it was a surreal and the most beautiful experience. We were able to shoot right where the butterflies create these colonies, these clusters. It's very, very sensitive because they're sleeping, they're hibernating. You can't really disturb them. You can't put like reflectors or lights. You have to be very quiet. You can't speak loud. You know, people were like literally crying. It was so powerful. Like, and it's like millions of butterflies, and you had to respect them. You know, it was like a respect. You know, we're here. We're gonna point the camera at you. We're gonna film you, but we understand that you're like in a very kind of delicate hibernation mode. And you know, we had to walk 5 hours with film equipment on horses. You know, we arrived there exhausted. It was like 7 in the morning. We had to leave at like 3 in the morning. And we arrived, and when the sun comes out and it hits the branches, the butterflies start flapping their wings. And so we caught that on camera. It was a surreal experience. And I recommend everybody, I mean, you need to go to the butterfly sanctuaries because I don't think I've ever seen anything as surreal and as beautiful as that sounds. And you hear there's sound also because all of the flapping wings, it sounds like a waterfall. You hear this because we're talking millions of butterflies.
That sounds beautiful. I mean, just watching this film, I was like, I would love to go visit. It looks gorgeous. That sounds like such an amazing, just like surreal experience to be able to kind of capture this moment that is just so delicate and like not everyone gets to see. And I love to see it through your film.
Yeah, and there are not that many, you know, there's like Nat Geo, Discovery Channel, they go there. Of course, there's a lot of films about monarch butterflies and documentaries, but there aren't that many like fiction, like personal stories that, I think this was one of the first ones actually that actually created a fictionalized story. And, you know, I remember that I was shooting with the kids holding the butterflies. And then when we had a guide with us that made sure that, you know, we got there and also how we treated them. And after we shot, he came to me and he said, you know, this kid with the butterfly, that was me growing up. Like I would come here and I would play with the butterflies. And he's like, it's amazing to see it that you're making that film. You're making the film about my childhood. And also the film that takes place in the 80s. So it was like literally his childhood, you know.
That's so cool that person was able to connect with that experience.
Yeah, it was powerful, yeah.
Wow. Is there anything else that you want to share about the film?
The importance of having diverse kind of representation in, you know, especially Latinos in film. I think it's really important to have, you know, whether you like my film or not, I think at least it shows a scientist that is dark-skinned, and it shows that, you know, that there's not one type of immigration story. It's not only about crossing the border. I think there are many people that are here and have other types of profession. And I think it's also important to show films where you can cross the border back and forth. And it's not only about like the stories of like suffering and pain. There is suffering and pain in my film, but it's a more existential, like inner trauma that he has. And I think that I hope that all of these like young kids that want to become scientists or artists or, you know, like Latinos that are first generation, second generation, they watch the film and they're like, oh, wow, like I want to be like Tenoch, you know, I want to be a scientist. I want to study like butterflies. I want to study like genetics. And we need more of that kind of representation because it obviously is part of the scientific community, but we don't see it in popular culture and we don't see it in film. So that would be my main kind of hope, that people identify and say like, oh, that's my story, or like I understand, like, or I also lived between two countries. I came to the U.S. or my parents came, and we're seeing it also with like the current administration with like Kamala Harris, and it's amazing, and I hope that enriches representation, and people can feel the courage to go into those fields. So.
That's so important and just so powerful. Like, as fellow Latino, to see a Mexican American biologist, that's something that exists in our world, of course, but we don't always get to see that on screen. It's just so powerful.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also my story. So
if you like this one, you can check out more of my Sundance coverage right over here, and I will catch you in the next video. See ya.